Harlan West entered the silver oak grill, his presence slicing through the room like a blade. Crystal light spilled cold over the tables, turning every eye toward him. He sat without acknowledgement, a king claiming territory, and with a flick of his wrist demanded service. Elara Jones stepped forward, tray trembling under her grip. He spoke at once, ordering a rare dish in butchered Japanese, each syllable dripping with mockery. A murmur swept the diners. Some smirked, others froze the silence, pressing like iron against their chests. Elara lowered her gaze, her knuckles white, the glasses shaking faintly. This was not a mistake. It was humiliation sharpened for spectacle, and it was only the first strike. Stay with this story, because what happens next will tear apart everything Harlan thought untouchable. Drop a like now, and don't look away. The worst is still to come. Her name was Elara Jones. To the wealthy patrons of the Silver Oak Grill, that name meant nothing. She was a shadow in black and white, a figure gliding between tables, vanishing as quickly as the dishes she carried. For them, she was service, nothing more, a hand refilling glasses, a smile rehearsed into silence. They forgot her face the moment she stepped away. But inside, Elara burned a memory few could imagine. Years ago, she was the student who answered every question the one teachers leaned on when the class faltered. She was fluent, not just in words, but in patience, in clarity, in the music of language itself. Her teachers told her she was born to instruct, to guide, to open doors others could not see. She believed them. She dreamed of standing one day before a classroom of her own young voices, rising as she taught them to bridge worlds through speech. That light had not vanished. Beneath the starched apron and weary posture, it glowed faintly like a lamp hidden behind heavy curtains. No guest sipping their wine could see it. But it was there, waiting. In high school, that hidden light had first flared. Elara had discovered Japanese, and with it a strange new horizon. She buried herself in grammar books while her friends laughed. Why waste time, they jeered. You'll never use it. But the mockery only steeled her. She filled notebooks with kanji scratched in fading ink, her pen carving shapes no one else cared to understand. Each character felt like a key, unlocking a door in her mind. She whispered the syllables late at night, testing their weight on her tongue. Where others heard nonsense, she heard rhythm, a pulse that carried meaning across oceans. The more they laughed, the more fiercely she worked. Her teacher noticed. He told her she possessed a gift, an ear that could catch tone and nuance, a discipline rare in one so young. One day you'll go far from here, he said. And she believed him. While classmates dreamed of cars and small-town romances, Elara dreamed of boarding planes, stepping into streets lit by foreign neon teaching children who spoke another tongue. Her Japanese was not just a subject. It was a ladder, and every word lifted her one step higher from the gray sameness of her town. Her faith was rewarded. Elara earned a scholarship that carried her across the ocean into a year that would shape her life. Tokyo enveloped her, its restless lights, its endless trains, its language humming through every billboard and every voice in the crowd. For the first time, she was not strange. She belonged to the rhythm around her. She lived with a host family who treated her like blood. Every evening she sat at their kitchen table repeating phrases until her accent sharpened, until her mouth shaped sounds with native precision. She bowed when they bowed, listened when they fell silent, learned that respect was a language of its own. The city gifted her confidence. She walked its streets with notebooks tucked under her arm, repeating kanji against the neon glow. In shrines and subway stations, in classrooms and quiet corners, she discovered herself disciplined, fluent, alive. When she returned to America, she carried Tokyo inside her. The gestures, the cadence, the reverence, it all lingered in her bones. She came back not just fluent, but transformed. Her dream expanded not only to speak, but to teach, to share what she had been given. The world no longer felt distant. It was hers to reach. Then came the fracture. One night the call arrived. Her father was gone, sudden and merciless. The house grew smaller that evening, walls closing in as grief swallowed breath. Her mother bent beneath the weight, taking shifts at the laundromat by day and scrubbing offices by night. Lines carved themselves across her face, the toll of exhaustion written in silence. Elara watched powerless as bills gathered like storm clouds. Her younger brother needed shoes for school books to hold in his small hands, meals to carry him through. The scholarship she clutched was no longer a promise. It was a burden her family could not carry. Tuition, rent, survival, they collided, and choice became a blade. She set the dream aside. not with bitterness but with a heavy tenderness as though laying a flower on a grave. The vision of standing before a classroom faded, replaced by the echo of her father's absence and the sound of her mother's weary cough. Life demanded sacrifice. And Alara, still so young, stepped forward to pay it. She traded notebooks for trays, the scholarship for an apron. At a small diner with peeling paint and humming lights, Alara began her new life. The pen that once shaped kanji now scribbled orders. Her hands, once marked with ink, bore the weight of steaming plates. Nights stretched long. She balanced trays until her wrists ached, cleared tables while laughter floated from mouths that never looked her in the eye. At dawn, she woke again to cook rice and eggs for her brother, her mother still gone to another shift. Fatigue seeped into her bones, a constant hum that never let go. Customers glanced through her as though she were part of the furniture, an invisible figure orbiting their comfort. They left tips like loose change for silence, never wondering what dreams had been smothered beneath her uniform. In their indifference, she disappeared, and in disappearing she learned how invisible dignity could be. Yet, when the night fell, something stirred. After the last table was cleared and her shoes left marks on the worn linoleum, Alara would sit in her narrow room. The air smelled of detergent from her mother's clothes, of fatigue heavy as stone. Still, she opened her notebook. She whispered Japanese phrases into the dark. The syllables softened her like embers refusing to die. Her younger brother once caught her. "Why waste energy on this? You'll never use it," he teased. She only smiled, repeating the lesson their mother had carved into her. Respect is never wasted. The kanji became her refuge, a secret rhythm against despair. With every stroke of the pen, she held on to the girl she had been, the teacher she still wished to be. Her body bent under exhaustion, but her spirit resisted. In the silence, she guarded that small flame, and though the world had forgotten, it had not gone out. At the Silver Oak Grill, she was only a server. The crisp black and white uniform flattened her into anonymity, its neat lines hiding the shoes worn thin at the seams. Her polite smile masked fatigue, carved into her bones, a smile that existed only to soften the impatience of strangers. To the guests, she was not a person, she was a vessel carrying plates, clearing crumbs, silent and replaceable. Every detail of her effort was invisible. They noticed the glass of wine, not the hand that placed it. They tasted the food, not the woman who carried it across the room on aching wrists. She had become an object in their theater of wealth. But Harlan noticed. His eyes lingered not with curiosity, but with the cold precision of a predator choosing prey. Among all the servers, he marked her, sensing the quiet restraint that wrapped around her like armor. To him, her composure was not strength, it was a weakness to be pierced. And in that instant, she was no longer invisible. She was a target. Harlan's gaze was sharp like a blade testing for flesh. He studied the faint tremor of her tray, the careful tilt of her chin, the silence she wore as a shield. He saw patience, endurance, and mistook it for fragility. The decision settled in him, he would break her. The room began to notice. Conversation slowed, forks paused midair. An unease gathered, though no one spoke. It was in the air, thick as smoke, pressing down on every table. The hum of wealth and laughter dimmed, as if the restaurant itself sensed the cruelty about to unfold. Alara felt the weight of his stare. She lowered her eyes, steadying her breath, but the awareness spread like fire under her skin. Around her, patrons shifted, waiting for entertainment or scandal, they were not sure which. Harlan leaned back, fingers tapping against mahogany, already savoring the theater he was about to stage. The first strike had yet to land, but the audience was already in their seats. Two lives converged in that quiet storm. Alara, once the gifted student of languages, now cloaked in an apron that concealed both her strength and her history. Harlan, the powerful executive, veiled in the disguise of a customer, a mask that gave him permission to play tyrant without consequence. The contrast was stark, yet invisible to the crowd. They saw only a waitress and a guest. They did not see the years of sacrifice pressed into Alara's smile, nor the empire of arrogance packed into Harlan's presence. But the moment hung suspended, fragile as glass, threads of the past tangled with the present. The girl who once mastered kanji in dim light stood opposite the man who mistook silence for weakness. Their worlds were not meant to cross. Yet here they were, colliding in a room gilded with crystal and whispers. No diner could guess what waited beyond that collision. But the air already carried it inevitability, the taste of something about to shatter. Harlan began with a smile that was no smile at all. He requested a dish almost impossible to find, reciting its name in twisted Japanese syllables bent until they cracked. The sound was deliberate, an insult parading as ignorance. He leaned back, waiting for her confusion, waiting for laughter to bloom around him. Elara held her pen steady. She did not wince, though she felt the words slash across her skin. She nodded once, noting down what she could, keeping her face a mask. The refusal to react only sharpened his grin. Around them, diners exchanged glances. A man shook his head, a woman whispered to her companion. They knew this was no simple order, it was a game of cruelty, yet none spoke, none intervened. Their silence laid the stage for him. Harlan tapped his fingers on the table, amused at her composure. To him, her calm was not dignity, but denial, a wall he intended to break brick by brick. This was only the beginning. The next move came sudden casual. Harlan tipped his glass water, spilling in a glittering arc across the tablecloth. It ran swiftly, soaking the edge, seeping into a woman's leather handbag nearby. Gasps rose, but no one spoke. "Clean it," he said, his voice low but edged with command. Elara moved quickly, blotting the spreading stain. Her hands worked with practiced efficiency, though inside her chest tightened. Every eye in the room was on her now, not on him. The scene framed her as the failure, the servant scrambling at his feet. Harlan reclined in his chair, arms crossed, a smirk tugging at his lips. The satisfaction came not from the spill, but from her submission, the sight of her bending while he remained untouched. The air thickened with discomfort. A few diners shifted restless, but the silence held. In their quiet, his power grew heavier, pressing her lower. He was not finished. A fork clattered onto the marble, then a knife dropped with calculated carelessness. The metal rang sharp as a bell, drawing heads from every table. Elara stooped, reaching for them. The tray in her other hand tilted, glasses rattling as she balanced. She crouched, then lowered further, knees brushing the polished floor. Harlan's eyes gleamed. He looked down at her as though the roles had been carved in stone, he above, she below. From a corner, laughter broke. A young man chuckled, muffling his voice behind a napkin. Another pulled out his phone, the red light of recording glowing like a wound. The cruelty spread a ripple of entertainment, passing from table to table. In that moment, the restaurant became an arena. Elara, on her knees, mocked and filmed a spectacle crafted by his hand. The sound of cutlery in her grasp was drowned by the weight of humiliation pressing in from every corner. The manager appeared at last, shoes clicking hesitantly against the marble. His eyes darted between Harlan West and the waitress crouched on the floor. For a breath, it seemed justice might finally step forward. But recognition hit him. The tailored suit, the name whispered across Wall Street. This was no ordinary guest. His lips parted, words trembling at the edge, yet fear strangled them before they escaped. He swallowed, offered a half-hearted nod in Harlan's direction, and turned away. The cowardice was clear, painted on his hunched shoulders as he retreated toward the safety of the bar. Elara saw it all. The one figure who could have shielded her vanished into silence. Betrayal did not arrive with noise. It came with footsteps retreating, leaving her abandoned in the center of the storm. The realization was heavier than the tray she carried. She stood alone now, unprotected, exposed, and more vulnerable than ever before. Harlan leaned forward, his lips curling. The next attack came not in English but in Japanese, delivered in flawless rhythm, his tone dripping with venom. The words themselves were hidden from the crowd, but the contempt carried in his voice was unmistakable. The diners stiffened. A ripple of unease spread. Some chuckled, assuming the waitress too ignorant to understand. Others whispered, smirking at the sound of a billionaire reducing a server with a tongue no one else could decipher. At the far end of the bar, an old woman frowned, her hand tightening around her glass. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. The weight of silence pressed down harder than any insult. For the rest, it was theater, a powerful man wielding language like a private weapon, bludgeoning a target no one expected to fight back. Elara stood motionless, the sting of every syllable cutting across her skin. Humiliation had become a performance, and the audience had chosen to stay seated. Elara bit her lip, the metallic taste of fear sharp on her tongue. Her hand clutched the silver tray until her knuckles whitened. Breath came shallow heart-hammering, as if the world narrowed to the man before her. But beneath the panic stirred memory. Nights in Tokyo, paper lanterns glowing, her host mother guiding her through each sound, each bow, each quiet lesson of respect. The weight of her father's absence, the strength of her mother's weary voice repeating the same truth: respect is never wasted. The words surged through her now, not as comfort but as a weapon honed by years of sacrifice. She lifted her eyes, and in their dark reflection something shifted. Fear receded. A flame sparked quiet but undeniable burning in defiance. The predator had struck too many times. The prey was no longer trembling. The room had yet to notice, but the turn had already begun. Harlan pressed harder. His voice rose sharp and deliberate, every syllable delivered like a blade. He repeated his insults with theatrical cruelty, savoring the discomfort that rippled outward. Each word was slower, heavier, designed not just to wound, but to display dominance. The crowd responded with nervous energy. Phones lifted higher their lenses, catching every angle of humiliation. Laughter cracked from one corner, echoing through the hush like cruel applause. The spectacle had grown no longer private, now it was entertainment. Ilara's body trembled, but something in her gaze shifted. Beneath the quiver of her hands, a stillness began to form, fragile yet steady. She endured the storm not as prey shrinking from the strike, but as someone bracing for the turn. Harlan leaned forward, louder still, daring her to break. The more he escalated, the more the tension tightened, coiling around the room like a wire ready to snap. The laughter swelled. The storm was his, or so it seemed. But storms do not last forever. The room changed. At one table, a father pulled his young daughter close, shielding her from the spectacle as if cruelty itself could stain. At another, a woman whispered under her breath, "This is too much." Yet her voice never rose beyond a murmur. Fear held them. No one intervened. No one stopped the unraveling. Their silence became a cage around Ilara, a stage built for her collapse. But she did not collapse. Slowly, deliberately, she rose to her full height, shoulders, squared tray steady once more. She fixed her eyes on Harlan, not with defiance spoken aloud, but with the calm fire of endurance refusing to yield. The air thickened. Conversations died altogether. Even the faint music from the background seemed to falter, fading into stillness. Every diner sensed it, the pause before the strike, the quiet before something breaks. No one knew what words might follow. Yet everyone felt it the moment had shifted. The silence now belonged to her. Harlan reached for his glass, lifting it high as though to seal a victory only he could see. The wine caught the chandelier's glow, casting red across his smirk. He tilted his head back, savoring the hush, then spoke a single word, pathetic. The syllables landed like a stone dropped into water, rippling through the room. A few diners flinched, some lowered their eyes. For them, the outcome seemed certain. The waitress would bow, absorb the insult, and disappear back into her shadows. But Ilara's hands had steadied. The tray no longer shook. Her eyes narrowed, fixing on him with a clarity that cut deeper than his sneer. The trembling that marked her before was gone, replaced by something harder, sharper. Time slowed. The pause stretched longer, each heartbeat magnifying the tension. The crowd leaned inward, waiting for collapse, for surrender, for the breaking point. Instead, they found themselves on the edge of something else entirely. Ilara drew a long breath. The tremor in her hands stilled fear, dissolving into a clarity that startled even her. The tray balanced easily now, as though its weight no longer mattered. Her chest rose, once steady, and then the words left her mouth. Japanese, clean, fluent, precise. Each syllable cut through the air like polished steel. The rhythm of the language was undeniable, the sharp consonants, the cadence mastered through years of study, now wielded with the force of revelation. The sound cleaved the silence. Forks froze in mid-air, breaths caught the entire room, snapping taut around her voice. No one had expected it, least of all Harlan. He sat, stunned lips parted, his face suddenly stripped of its armor. For the first time the balance tilted. The predator looked cornered. Ilara did not falter. She stood firm, her voice rising again in flawless precision, striking back with the very tool he had tried to use against her. And the silence that followed was not weakness. It was victory, loud in its stillness. The room erupted not in noise, but in disbelief. Dozens of heads snapped toward her at once, eyes wide, mouths open. The crash of silver against porcelain echoed as utensils slipped from fingers gone slack. Ilara's words flowed on each phrase in Japanese, deliberate, calm, yet sharp enough to draw blood. Every sound confirmed that she had not merely studied, but lived the language, carried it in her marrow. At his table, Harlan stiffened, frozen, as though the world had turned upside down. His smirk had vanished. In its place, a pale rigidity. He, the master of humiliation, found himself silenced before the very crowd he had sought to impress. No one dared to interrupt. The hush was more explosive than applause. Diners who had moments earlier laughed now stared in awe, struggling to reconcile the image of a waitress with the authority of her voice. She continued unflinching, and each syllable drove the twist deeper. Then Alara shifted. Ilara. She let the Japanese cadence fall away, and in crisp, steady English she carried the words to every corner of the room. Respect cannot be bought. It cannot be stolen. It can only be given. The statement struck harder than any insult, reverberating in the silence that followed. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then scattered applause rose, hesitant but insistent, like sparks refusing to die. Some diners clapped, others nodded their admiration, cautious but real. Yet not all were swayed. A few in tailored suits leaned back, arms crossed, lips curled in disdain. Their silence sided with Harlan, unwilling to believe a servant's dignity could outweigh wealth. At the center, Harlan gripped the arms of his chair, fingers white jaw locked. The echo of her words had pierced, but pride refused to yield. Ilara's gaze did not leave him. She had spoken not for him, but for everyone else who had chosen to remain silent. The room did not unite behind her. From a corner table, a wealthy man leaned close to his companion and muttered, "She's just showing off." His words slid across the silence, carrying weight. A few nodded in quiet agreement, their eyes flicking toward Harlan as though his wealth still guaranteed victory. The dining hall fractured into two camps. Some applauded her courage, others clung to power as if its presence could not be challenged by a woman in an apron. The division thickened the air, every gesture, every whisper adding layers of tension. Ilara stood unshaken, her eyes fixed on Harlan, her posture straight. She did not flinch at their doubt. If anything, the resistance sharpened her resolve. Harlan's chest rose, the faint trace of a smile pulling at his mouth. He sensed the wavering, the hesitation among his audience. The silence fed him a reminder that control could be seized again if he struck at the right angle. The game was not over. It was shifting. Harlan leaned forward, the smirk blooming across his face once more. When he spoke again, it was not the crude insults from before. His voice carried confidence, a scholar's fluency in complex Japanese. He invoked keiretsu alliances of corporations, intricate webs of loyalty and finance. Words few in the room could grasp, but the cadence itself declared superiority. Diners exchanged uncertain looks. They did not understand the language, but they recognized the strategy. This was no insult, now it was a trap. If she faltered, the illusion of mastery would shatter, and Harlan would reclaim the stage. His tone dripped with condescension, as though the very complexity of his words guaranteed her failure. He folded his hands, leaning back, eyes gleaming with the certainty of triumph. The challenge hung heavy. If she stumbled, she would fall. If she rose, he would unravel. Ilara did not falter. She inhaled softly, the flame in her eyes steady. When she spoke, her Japanese was not only fluent, but vivid, threading nuance and metaphor with ease. She spoke of keiretsu not as theory, but as living structure networks bound by loyalty, resilience, and mutual respect. Her words flowed with authority, seamless in rhythm, unbroken in thought. It was the language of someone who had not just studied, but lived inside its heartbeat. Then, with deliberate calm, she shifted into English, her gaze sweeping the room. It is about unity, about loyalty, principles that thrive when leaders respect those around them. Principles you, her voice sharpened, seemed to have forgotten. Gasps scattered across the restaurant. Some diners whispered in awe, others nodded as though a veil had been lifted from their eyes. The confidence Harlan had carried cracked, replaced with a flicker of rage barely contained. For the first time, the trap had snapped shut on him. The first clap came softly from a woman near the bar. Her husband followed with a firm nod, his palms striking together, unwilling to remain silent. The sound broke the tension like glass, and others began to stir. Some diners straightened in their seats, shifting their allegiance without words. Younger guests raised their phones higher, capturing every breath, every flicker of the confrontation. One pressed live, and suddenly the Silver Oak Grill was no longer a room, but a broadcast. Across feeds and timelines, the scene began to ignite, a spark racing outward faster than anyone inside could see. Harlan noticed. His eyes darted to the glowing screens, the small red circles of recording, the hushed voices narrating his collapse in real time. For a man who had built his image on fear and reverence, the knowledge struck deeper than any insult. The humiliation was no longer private, it was global, and, once released, it could not be contained. The realization drove him to fury. Harlan slammed his hand against the table, the sound booming through the hall like thunder. Crystal trembled and its stemware plates rattled on their chargers. His voice roared over the silence. "You are just a waitress. I am the one who builds empires." Some guests flinched, others recoiled as though the words themselves carried heat. But behind his rage a hollow note emerged, the desperation of a man watching his authority slip through his hands. The grandeur of his claim no longer inspired awe, it exposed weakness. Ilara stood motionless. She did not bow, did not flinch. Her stillness was more cutting than any retort. The crowd sensed it. The empire he boasted of was no longer towering. It was crumbling stone by stone in front of them all. His roar was not dominance. It was collapse. Ilara moved forward one step at a time until the space between them closed. She did not raise her voice. Instead, she let silence sharpen her words. "Power without respect," she said slowly. "Each syllable deliberate is only an empty mask." The words fell heavy, reverberating through the room. Conversations stopped. Breaths caught as if the very air had stilled to listen. A man at the nearest table exhaled audibly, the sound breaking the suffocating quiet. The weight of silence turned back on Harlan, pressing down like stone. He had shouted, cursed, raged, but her calm exposed the void beneath his fury. In her composure he saw the truth he had spent a lifetime denying. Authority without dignity is nothing. The strike was not loud, but it cut deeper than any scream. Phones rose like a forest of mirrors, every guest capturing the collapse from every angle. Screens glowed, red dots blinked, the soft hum of recording filled the air. Harlan's stage, once his to command, had turned into a cage he could not escape. He turned, scanning the room for a friendly face, for even one ally. None appeared. Instead, he saw only lenses reflecting his faltering image, his undoing preserved for strangers beyond these walls. Sweat purled on his forehead, slipping down his temple. He tugged at his collar, but the air seemed too thin, heavy with judgment. The practiced smile he had worn for decades trembled, then collapsed altogether. In that instant he realized what he had lost. The fear he once wielded was gone. The crowd no longer bowed. They stared, unflinching, unafraid. His empire of presence had dissolved in a storm of digital glass. For the first time, Harlan West looked powerless. Ilara stood tall, her tray abandoned, her uniform no longer binding her into invisibility. In her eyes burned something undeniable dignity that forced every gaze in the room to shift. The guests looked not at a servant, but at a woman whose quiet strength had stripped arrogance bare. Each person felt the weight of the lesson. It slid over them silently. Respect was more commanding than wealth, more enduring than fear. Harlan slumped in his chair, shoulders, heavy chest rising shallowly as if air itself resisted him. His lips curled into a crooked smile, not of triumph, but of surrender. He exhaled once and then let the mask slip. "I suppose you should know," he muttered, his voice thin. "I am not just a customer." The room stilled. The revelation landed like a blow. The predator had confessed his disguise. Harlan West, CEO, had been undercover all along. Gasps surged like a wave. A woman clutched her pearls. A man dropped his phone in disbelief. And from the back the voice of a young guest streaming live cut through the chaos. "It's him, the CEO of West Corp." The declaration spread fast. Whispers collided, disbelieving and stunned. No one could reconcile the figure slumped at the table with the titan who commanded boardrooms. To see him here, masquerading as a guest, unraveling before a waitress, it was unthinkable. Yet the evidence lay plain, his words, his arrogance, his collapse caught on 100 screens. The revelation did not restore his power. It destroyed it. The disguise, meant to let him observe his empire in secret, had instead stripped him of it. Laughter trickled awkward at first, then stronger. For the first time, Harlan West was not feared, but mocked. And before him, Ilara stood, not bowed, not broken, but unshaken, her presence towering above the man who had tried to bury her. The victor was clear, and it was not the CEO. In the charged silence of Harlan's defeat, another figure rose from the far end of the dining hall. Tall, composed, every movement precise, Draven Kells commanded attention without arrogance. His suit was immaculate, but it was not wealth that gave him weight. It was the quiet authority of a man accustomed to shaping futures. Conversations halted as he crossed the floor. The rhythm of his steps echoed soft yet final, pulling the room into stillness. Even the glow of recording screens lowered, drawn toward him as though gravity itself had shifted. His eyes never once strayed to Harlan. Instead, they rested on Ilara, steady, respectful, unshaken. When he reached her, he paused, allowing the silence to settle, then offered his hand with a measured smile. The gesture was simple, but its meaning rang clear. Power was no longer seated at Harlan's table. It stood here beside Alara Jones. Draven's voice carried calm, yet undeniable. What I witnessed tonight, he said, was not submission. It was leadership. The words struck the room like a bell. Gasps rippled, followed by applause that swelled louder with each passing second. Diners stood clapping, cheering, some whistling as though a veil had lifted from their eyes. He turned fully toward Alara. You have what we need: strength in the face of arrogance, dignity in the face of cruelty. I would be honored to have you join our international team. Her breath caught, yet her stance remained composed. The moment was surreal, but the truth of it was undeniable. Her voice, her courage had shifted the course of her life. Around them, the clapping rose to a crescendo. The crowd had chosen its victor, and it was not the man sinking silently in his chair. Harlan West sat rigid, his face pale, stripped of every illusion of control. For a long moment, Harlan did not move. His empire of fear had dissolved, his audience gone, his mask torn. At last, he lowered his head, shoulders sagging under the weight of humiliation. When he spoke, his voice cracked rough and small, nothing like the thunder he had unleashed earlier. Tonight, he whispered, it is I who has been taught the lesson. No laughter followed, no jeering, only silence, a silence heavy with recognition that they were watching the fall of a man who had believed himself untouchable. Power, once worn like armor, now hung in tatters. The mighty CEO sat exposed, humbled, his arrogance scattered across the marble floor like broken glass. He was no longer the king of the table. He was a dethroned monarch stripped before his court, and the image of his surrender would be carried far beyond the walls of this restaurant. Alara did not smile in triumph. No smirk, no trace of vengeance lingered on her face. Instead, she looked at Harlan with a calmness that carried weight beyond anger. Her voice was steady, almost gentle. Respect is never wasted. The words settled like a benediction. Guests who had once laughed now bowed their heads. A woman dabbed at her eyes with a napkin, overcome by the gravity of what she had witnessed. A man at another table whispered to himself, repeating the phrase as though etching it into memory. The atmosphere shifted, heavy but pure, as if the entire room had been stripped of pretense. It no longer felt like a dining hall. It felt like a place of reckoning, a baptism of dignity where arrogance had been drowned and something cleaner emerged. Alara stood quietly at its center, not as a server, not as a victim, but as the voice of a truth too long ignored. Draven stepped forward once more, his hand reaching into his jacket. From within, he drew a card, the embossed letters glinting under the chandeliers. He extended it to Alara with a nod of respect. Our company needs you, he said, his voice carrying no hint of performance. What you showed here tonight is the kind of strength that builds futures. Ilara's fingers trembled slightly as she accepted the card, but her composure never broke. She bowed her head in gratitude, her gaze lifting toward something unseen, something ahead. The diners erupted again, applause breaking like a tide. They were not cheering a victory of status. They were celebrating a door opening a future carved by resilience. For Alara, the night no longer ended in humiliation. It ended in possibility. Harlan rose at last, the weight of silence pressing on his shoulders like chains. His stride, once commanding, dragged across the polished floor. The suit that had once radiated power now seemed only a costume frayed by disgrace. The chandeliers above cast harsh light, no longer gilding him in prestige, but exposing him in judgment. Every step echoed heavy and slow, as though the room itself had turned into a tribunal. He reached the door without looking back. For a moment he paused, his hand against the brass handle as though seeking some fragment of dignity. But when the door swung shut behind him, the sound was not escape, it was sentence. The silver oak grille no longer belonged to him. He had been erased from it, leaving only the memory of his collapse. Slowly, the restaurant returned to its meal. Silverware lifted again, conversations resumed, but nothing was the same. Every eye that passed over Alara now carried respect, the quiet acknowledgement of what had unfolded before them. She was no longer a shadow among their luxury. She was the center of it, the weight of dignity pressing gently into their memory. Applause rippled one final time, softer now, not the roar of victory, but the affirmation of truth. The diners knew they would never forget this night. The humiliation had turned into revelation, and its echo would linger long after the tables were cleared. The silver oak grill had witnessed a fall, but more than that, it had borne witness to a rise. Elara stepped into the night. Rain slicked the pavement, turning every light into a reflection, every shadow into silver. The city glowed with a quiet brilliance as if it too had been remade. She drew in a deep breath, the air crisp against her lungs. It tasted different, like beginning, not survival. For years she had walked with her head bowed, but now her stride carried purpose, her steps firm against the wet stone. The night was not an ending. It was the first page of something larger, a journey unfolding beneath the city's shimmer. And as she moved forward, the world seemed ready to follow. Elara stepped out from the silver oak grill, leaving its heavy silence behind. The city stretched before her, its lights bleeding across wet asphalt like veins of cold fire. Night wind swept past, laced with the bitterness of smoke and steel. Her steps were slow, deliberate, no longer trembling, each one carried the weight of destiny's hammer-striking stone. The echoes followed her, not of humiliation, but of truth reclaimed. Power concedes nothing without a demand.